Hello, and welcome to the Scott Mize Show, a podcast focused on health, diet, bodybuilding, and philosophy. I interview experts, doctors, coaches, and N=1 case studies to answer your questions about improving health, achieving your best physique, and making sustainable progress. We'll cover topics from carnivore and ketogenic diets, to bodybuilding, to life philosophy, and everything in between. Enjoy the show. This episode is brought to you by LMNT Electrolytes. This month, we're switching it up with an exclusive offer that's only for VIP LMNT partners, including Carnivore Cast listeners. You can now receive this free sample pack along with any regular purchase when you use my custom link, which is provided in the show notes or my Instagram link in bio. That's drinklmnt.com/carnivorecast, all one word. And as I said, I'll include the link in the show notes. LMNT Electrolytes are convenient, evidence-based, and delicious, and get yours today to help support the show. Thank you. This is a quick disclaimer before we start the show. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Nothing said here should be taken as medical advice, and please consult with your physician before making any changes to your diet, exercise regime, or medications. Thank you, and on to the show. Dr. Alexander Hutchinson is a prominent figure in health and fitness, standing at the forefront of discussions surrounding doping and PEDs in sports and fitness, with the release of his third book, In Defense of Doping, Reassessing the Level Playing Field. He serves as the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Cellular Physiology. Dr. Hutchinson was a collegiate swimmer, then a coach, guiding athletes to Ironman triathlons and races like the Boston Marathon. Welcome to the show, Dr. Hutchinson.
How you doing? Thank you so much.
Yeah, great. Really excited. Really interesting topic. I have followed a lot of sports, followed PEDs in sports. I think everyone at this point has probably seen the Icarus documentary on Netflix, as well as Bigger, Stronger, Faster. I think that was the name of the Chris Bell documentary. So really interested in this topic. First, would just love to hear more about your background, what got you interested in this topic, and discussing it.
Well, I've got a PhD in exercise physiology. And during that, so, obviously swimming has been the sport that I competed in, but the one that I've followed the most that's not your traditional American sports is international cycling. So the Tour de France in particular is my favorite race. So obviously it has a very checkered history with performance-enhancing drug use, starting all the way back at the initial Tour de France in 1903, and then all the way through its history up to now. And so that was a background story for years and years as I was finishing off my undergraduate degree, which was not in kinesiology. It was actually in biology. And then when I went to get my master's degree, that was right at the time that Armstrong was beginning his streak of 7 consecutive victories.
Wow.
And then right around the same time as he was finishing up, I was finishing my PhD. And just the amount of information that you acquire when you're doing a doctorate, whether it's going to be a medical doctorate or a PhD, it's just voluminous. I mean, you just read and read and read and read. And then slowly over time, if you have an intellectual mind, if you have a curious mind, there's the potential, at least, for you to change your mind from where you were initially to where you actually end up later in life. And the large part of that evolution in terms of my thought process, because I was very, very anti-doping initially, was, part of that evolution really came along with just seeing, first off, how much injury potential there is in sports, especially as you get older. And then also just in terms of the nature of training, when you're a young coach, you follow basically the same rules and regulations and thought processes as the coaches that you had. And that may or may not be based in science at all. A lot of it's just anecdotal. My grandpapa used to do this, so I'm going to do it too. But, as you start to stick more science into your coaching philosophy, then you really start to see how important recovery is. It's actually just as important, if not more so, than the actual training that you're going to do for any of your respective events. And really the biggest thing that doping allows athletes to do is to recover faster and better than they would otherwise. So, that, part of my background is just looking at the science of recovery itself, not necessarily as it relates to doping, but you can certainly see very quickly that a lot of the things that people are taking are to hasten that process.
Yeah. Interesting. That's really fascinating. And maybe if we could just start, like, how would you define the term doping in sports?
Yeah, it used to be so. In terms of the history of that term, I have to actually put this in the book. There was a drink that was a concoction of different roots and berries and all this kinds of stuff in African cultures that was called doop. And a lot of athletes would take it right before they would athletes, not necessarily athletes, but warriors would take it before they would go into battle. To some degree, to steel their nerves before they had to go and face death. That progressed on to being used in other events because all these warring cultures would also have games that were stand-ins for battle during times of peace. That's what sport was initially.
Yeah.
Now, granted, we did a lot of the sports that initially came through were related to things that were more battle-like, and then they evolved from there. But you get the general idea that that's where that initial term comes from. So as it's defined, doping is any substance or method that's used for the purposes of gaining an athletic advantage. So when we hear the first term I heard the term blood doping was when it was being done in the '84 Olympics by our U.S. track cycling team. And this was pretty arcane, nasty stuff. They were just matching blood types with whoever in their family could donate some blood. And then they were literally stringing a line from one person, their family member, to that athlete to get in some additional red blood cells right before their event. So that's where I defined it as being something that's related to blood specifically. But effectively, it's just anything that's going to give you a performance enhancing boost. So in that case, that's what we're calling a method. Yeah. Right, we're taking blood from another individual, so this is what we call a homologous blood transfusion, as opposed to an autologous, which is the second thing that we typically see, whereas athletes will take their own blood out, store it for about a month, and then stick it back in. But it's any method or drug.
Okay. And where do you think the kind of rage against doping and PEDs in sports and stigma against it stemmed from? Is it kind of inherent in like the idea of cheating, or is it more than that?
That's a tricky one. And again, there's been an evolution of this over time as well, because there are very clear stories from the athletes themselves admitting to the fact that they were typically, and this is in the early ages of what we would consider modern doping. So we're talking like in the 50s and 60s. You have two examples that I put in my book. So you have Fasta Coppi. So he was the first person to win both the Giro and Tour in the same year. He did that twice. So he was really the first cycling superstar, Italian. And then the person who followed after him was a Frenchman. And both of them admitted readily to taking substances, typically amphetamines, to improve their performance. And no one cared. Yeah. It wasn't until you had the death of a cyclist, and he was a rather prominent one, Tommy Simpson, in the '66 Tour. And he was on the Ventoux, which is a huge alpine mountain.
Yeah.
Super hot day. He had taken amphetamines because he was trying desperately to place highly that particular tour. So he needed a new contract. And he also was known to drink brandy. So that combination of alcohol and amphetamines on a super hot day in a drier environment, and he ended up expiring largely because of dehydration. Once that happened, then there was this sea change in terms of the public perception of how we're going to attack this. They actually started doing tests for amphetamines, at least in '65 in the Tour. But even then, the punishments were very, very minor. So if you got caught, then you were typically, let's say that you won that day's stage, you were disqualified from the win, which means that you lost your prize money. You were given a 10-minute penalty and or dropped all the way down to last place, whichever one was going to be larger in terms of the time penalty. But that was it. You started the next day.
Yeah.
And so even then, over time, there was, this evolution, obviously, in terms of how we punish athletes. But, when did it really become this outrageous scandal? there's a couple of different times. So that would be one of them. The next one that I can see in my mind's eye in terms of the public reaction to it was 88 in Seoul, when you had Ben Johnson and Carl Lewis going up against each other in the 100-meter dash, and right. Johnson just demolished him. He demolished Carl Lewis.
Yeah.
Carl Lewis I'm a huge fan of Carl Lewis. He's also an alum from my university, University of Houston. He's currently the head track coach there. So
cool.
Big fan of his. But I remember watching that, and I follow track pretty well. So over the years, I remember watching Ben Johnson go from where he was in 84 when he got the bronze medal to 88 when he won the gold. And if you look at the pictures of his body over time, it's very clear that something big happened.
Yeah.
And so that was rather scandalous, because I think it was within 24 hours that he was disqualified and then sent home. And I think the public outrage, at least domestically within the United States, was, well, here's this guy stealing a gold medal from our hero. And so, we're really upset about that. And then after that, you potentially have Lyle Alzado dying from a brain tumor in 1991 as he's trying to make his comeback. And it's very clear that he's taking steroids and human growth hormone. But there's no link to those drugs that he was taking and there being the development of a brain tumor. No one's ever been able to link those two together. They never will be able to. It's sheer speculation as to whether that was the case or not. And then continuing on, the next thing that you see after that would be 1998 during the home run derby chase between Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa. Yeah. And then 3 years later, followed by Barry Bonds breaking that record again. And then in 2007, he broke the lifetime record, or the total career home run record. And you had the congressional hearings in 2003 and 5 about steroids in baseball. So again, people didn't really care, and then they cared a little bit, and then they care a lot. And why they care a lot is because I think they had their own vested interests in these sports heroes. Yeah. And then when you learn that they're taking things, at least at the time, if you're not fully educated on what that really means and why they're taking them, you may be offended by it. But then if you look at, and of course, the last one that I would throw in there is obviously Lance when he went down. But once that happened, now when we look at it, I mean, I've used this example a number of times because he's the latest football player that I've seen that has been suspended for performance enhancing drug use, and that's Jimmy Garoppolo. He's going to miss the first 4 games of this next football season. Beyond that, I haven't heard a single person comment on it, in any kind of a negative way. They just don't care anymore.
Yeah, interesting.
Particularly within, I mean, it happens all the time. When there's the hope that you can actually address this by punishing it out of existence, then many people will be emotionally invested in continuing that path, much like what we have in this country with the war on drugs. But after you see the collateral damage that's done to people by these wars that they have on specific drugs, either illicit or in this case, performance enhancing, and there's no change in terms of the behavior of people thereafter, then you start to question it as like, what are we really doing this for? Does it really matter? And that's the question that I raise is this really worth the damage that we're doing to the individual people when we consider what sports really is? Yeah. Sports is entertainment. It's the same as going to a music concert or going to a movie. Obviously, there's a difference to it in as much as you don't cheer for a movie, you don't cheer for a musician like you would an athlete, but it is still entertainment. Yeah. And so freaking out that someone has taken a drug because they were injured and they're trying to get themselves back in the playing field, especially when we look at what each of us does in our individual lives to improve our enhancement at the other things that we do, job, home, in bed, whatever the case may be. There's a number of drugs that are out there. Yeah. I mean, just look at Ozempic. In the last 24 months, this drug has gone from nobody knew what the hell it was to being a drug that was there for the purposes of treating type 2 diabetes that then also allowed you to lose some weight. And now everybody and their dog's taking it. And talk about a shortcut. My goodness, is Ozempic ever a shortcut to getting the desired outcome that you want in terms of weight loss? Yeah.
Yeah. You make excellent points. And I think, I started testosterone replacement therapy 7 years ago because I was hypogonadal. I had below osteoporosis levels of bone at the age of 24, which is almost unheard of. And I was shocked at how hard it was to get a prescription, to manage a prescription, to get it through insurance, all these things. And it's all trickle down effect from exactly what you're talking about. So not only are you inhibiting athletes' ability to recover and to improve their quality of life and reduce injury, it has trickle down effects for everyday people. Testosterone, a drug that it's an essential hormone in every man's life and women for that matter. And can help treat a lot of people who are depressed or really just hypogonadal and they're put on SSRIs. A lot of people who are overweight can benefit from it. But it's really unfortunate. It's a scheduled drug now because of primarily legislation from early 2000s. And I think a lot of that stemmed from the banning of PEDs.
I would agree. In terms of your difficulty in getting it approved by insurance, mine hasn't been for years.
Yeah.
It used to be when I first started taking testosterone, and I had a very similar experience. So in 1998, I was diagnosed with testicular cancer. And after my treatments there, things were fine for quite some time, but there were periods where I could feel that there was a dip and they would come back up, dip, come back up. And then my wife and I got married in 2010 and like immediately thereafter. And I don't think it's had anything to do with my wife, although, at the time she would disagree. She felt horrible about it, but I lost everything.
Yeah.
No libido, no nothing. We're trying to have a kid. So I went through very similar circumstances you did. I did find a good doctor who got me on HCG because you can't take exogenous testosterone if you're trying to have a kid because it knocks down your sperm count. So I stayed on HCG for quite some time until we had one miscarriage on the way. So it was a better part of 2 years in that process before we finally had a pregnancy that made it past the first trimester, who then obviously turned into my 13-year-old daughter. And that's when my doctor said, look, the HCG is super expensive, not covered by insurance. You're injecting yourself every other day. Yeah. I'm sure you're sick of it. I think you should switch to testosterone. I was like, sign me up. I'm in.
Yeah.
But then, my insurance company would cover it because there weren't a whole lot of people who were taking it. Yeah. But then as the popularity of that increased, the insurance company was, well, why are we paying for all this testosterone? There's no way this is really medical for the majority of these folks. They just want to. So that's fine. But, mine is not covered by insurance, but I got a super great deal through GoodRx and that kind of stuff. There's ways to manage it.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing. Trying to get some. So along these lines, we owned a gym in San Antonio for 3 years. We opened and owned and operated. And then running a gym is like no other job. There's never a day off ever.
Yeah.
You're always putting out a fire somewhere. So when we got an offer to sell it, I just absolutely take it. And we made a nice big old profit on it and I walked away from it. But right after that, I started doing some Olympic weightlifting. And so I went through the process of getting a therapeutic use exemption. What a nightmare process that was.
Yeah.
So spent the better part of a month chasing down all of my different doctors to get all the different medical records that they were requesting from WADA or USADA. And then they rejected it as soon as I sent it in.
Oh.
So I was like, well, what's the next step? And they're like, well, what we need you to do is you have to go off your testosterone for 6 months. You then have to wait 3 months before we'll test you to see that you're actually hypogonadic. And then you can go back on.
Oh.
So I'm like, you do realize that I'm just lifting age group. I'm not, I mean, this is a bunch of old farts who just want to go to an organized competition so we can actually, not have to do it ourselves. I don't care if you give me a medal. I won't go to any international competitions if I qualify. Yeah. I just want to be able to do it domestically. If you get caught, you're going to be banned for 4 years. Wow. So it's like, forget it. I just won't compete anymore. But that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of it doesn't make any sense. And like you said, where do you draw the line too, right? Pro athletes are now getting stem cells and getting, what's it called? Platelet-rich plasma and all these things. Mm-hmm. And where do you draw the line between that and something that's performance enhancing? It's kind of arbitrary, right?
Well, I think that the argument would be because what I've seen of late is that the platelet-enriched plasma therapy is something that you can get if you have the appropriate documentation. So the question is, obviously, for it to be a doping product, it has to meet one of 3 criteria. So the first being that it actually offers a performance-enhancing edge. The second one is that it's dangerous to the athlete. And if either one of those don't actually catch it, then the third one is their fallback, which is that it's against the spirit of sport to take this substance or use this method.
Okay.
And that's one of those that's it's so nebulous, and anybody can put that out there if they want to. But so, where do you draw the line? It's a good question. And the other problem that I have with this is that for the big drugs that we know, like testosterone, HGH, EPO, those have been tested in terms of what impacts they have on the human body and what impacts they have in terms of athletic performance. So we know that they definitely enhance performance.
Yeah.
But the vast majority of drugs that are on the banned list, they've never been tested to see what impact they have on athletic performance. And so we don't know. We're assuming that they will have an effect, and which makes sense. I mean, as much as if you're going to take it, you're thinking it's going to have an effect. The question is it right to ban somebody if they're taking a substance that's not necessarily detrimental to the health of the athlete, that the athlete thinks is impacting their performance positively, but it's not? So if they're taking something and you don't want them to because it's on the list, but you don't know for sure if it's actually having any effect on them, then is a 4-year ban really appropriate? It's hard to say. Yeah. So that's another one of the arguments against what WADA is currently doing.
Interesting. And what is PED testing and doping testing like in sports today? Can you just describe kind of the process first, and then maybe we can get into how accurate it is?
Well, let me start with the first part. The second part of your question there, I can tell you it's accurate. The tests are accurate. So you're not going to get many false positives. You just won't. Every time that you see an athlete who's denying what they've taken, male or female, they don't say anymore, that was never in my body, that test has to be wrong. They never say that anymore. They'll say, I never knowingly ingested it. Now, that may be true because these tests are so remarkably sensitive that they can pick up minute levels of any of these drugs, which would have zero impact on their athletic performance because there's so little of them in the body. That raises the question, is it likely that these athletes are getting this in their body by contamination? And there's plenty of documented evidence that has happened and continues to happen. Now, it can happen in a number of different ways. You can get it in food. You can get it in drink. You can get it in your own prescription drugs. When you think about like you and we've been to a CVS or a Walgreens to pick up our prescription, and we've seen behind them either the pharmacist or the pharm techs counting out the pills, 5 at a time. And then as soon as they're done with one prescription, they put all those extra pills back in the bottle, put it back in the shelf, and then they get out the next drug and they put it in the exact same plate and they use the exact same spatula to count out. They haven't cleaned anything.
Yeah.
So it's perfectly logical to think that there's some level of cross-contamination that can happen between drugs in any pharmacy. But the other place that it happens a great deal is within the formulary place itself, where they're actually putting the drugs together. If they don't clean those vats adequately, then you're going to have cross-contamination there as well. Yeah. There's one more place that we see contamination, and this is a really interesting one. There's at least two documented cases of female athletes receiving drugs that are on the banned list after having sex with their male partners. And they've been able to prove that those drugs came into their body through sex. Now, lucky them that they were actually able to do that. However, it's so invasive to have to ask these questions of people's sex lives. And luckily those people were both with their partners, but what if you had a one-night stand? What if you had an affair? What if you had a one-night stand and you can't find that guy anymore? What if you're a male athlete and you haven't come out of the closet yet? You had homosexual sex and you have contamination that way. Are we really interested in making these athletes expose every aspect of their personal private lives in order to fight off a contamination accusation in terms of doping? It's a tricky one.
Yeah.
You asked me originally how the doping works. Each sport has their own ways of doing things, but if they're WADA signees, then they will collect either blood or urine samples. They can do this at a scheduled time throughout their training season, in competition, out of competition, but then they're also going to be subject to random testing.
Okay.
To find them. Now, you have to to let WADA know where you are basically at all times. If you're on vacation, they have to know where they can find you because they can track you down and do it there as well. Depending on what they're actually testing for, they will either take urine or blood, or in some cases, hair. They will split that initial sample into two samples, an A and a B. They'll test the A first. If it comes back negative, they don't do anything. Although they do store and catalog those samples for at least 2 or 3 years because they're developing new tests for new drugs at all times, and they can retrospectively actually test those samples.
Okay.
If the A sample comes back positive, then the next thing they'll do is test the B sample. If the B sample comes back negative, you're clear. If the B sample comes back positive, that is a positive test, and then you are allowed an opportunity to respond. And you can take that challenge, depending on what their ruling is, all the way up to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is a 3-judge panel. And in that case, you're considered guilty until proven innocent, and you're responsible for proving your innocence. So that's how the testing method goes.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And that's kind of universal across sports, or does it vary a lot between types of sports, organizations, and stuff like that?
And the best example I can give where we have variance is with American sports. So the 4 major American sports leagues, they are not WADA signees. They don't use their particular methods. They don't test for their particular list of drugs. And this is a big deal for me because this is really where the crux of my solution to this problem comes in. The reason for the difference is because American sports have unions. They have athlete unions who engage in collective bargaining with their respective leagues to negotiate which drugs will be tested for, will not be tested for, how they're going to go about the testing, when they will do the testing, and then what the punishments will be for a first, second, or third offense. At the international level, there is no athlete representation whatsoever. So everything comes down from the governing bodies of each respective sport.
Okay.
So you have there's a group of individuals who to dictate everything about how that sport runs. And so this is where my solution to this problem is, or at least one of the potential solutions, is to make sure or try to move international sports towards what we have domestically, in as much as athletes must have a players union, an athletes union for each respective sport. And they deserve the right to collectively bargain and negotiate with each of the governing bodies to determine which drugs they will and won't test for.
Yeah.
Again, let's go back to the idea of what sports is. Sports is entertainment. And what's the product that we're actually buying? The right to watch those athletes on their respective playing fields. I'm not interested in I'm not buying this ticket so that I can, hear about what the IOC is interested in doing, or necessarily look at the particular venue. I want to see that athlete.
Yeah.
So that athlete is the product, and that allows them to have some rights in my mind in terms of what it is that they're allowed to do to provide or to perform at their best on that playing field and give me the best show I can buy.
Yeah.
Within reason, obviously. I mean, there's certain limitations that we do want to have on things, but you can't have, in my mind, a system where the athletes are completely exploited, which is exactly what we have on the international scene. When the solution to the problem is quite obvious, in as much as just give them a say. Along those lines, let me just quote some stats here.
Yeah,
if you
please.
look at the only way to really find out what percentage of your athletes are taking drugs, PEDs, is to provide an anonymous survey. That's the best way.
Yeah.
And if you look at on the international scene, studies that have done this. So let's see here. I'm looking at a couple. So we had the Pan Asian Games where they surveyed 45% of the athletes came back and said that they were taking some sort of performance enhancing substance. The World Athletic Championships, I believe in 2011, 30% of those athletes came back and said that they were taking something. Now, let's say that underestimates the total. It's probably a little bit higher because even then some athletes, something like that. It's going to be a big number. But if you already have almost half the athletes saying they're taking something, that's pretty big. If you
Yeah.
look at NFL data asking the same question, 10%. Okay,
Wow.
so what do I think the big difference is? I think the big difference is that athletes are not going to take those drugs if they know that the level for the playing field is already pretty well level as it is without them having to, and that the athletes in the NFL who are taking those drugs, by and large, there's a small percentage that are trying to maintain their position on the team by getting a little bigger, stronger, faster, but a lot of it is also trying to come back from injury.
Yeah.
You know, so if you have a situation where we have players unions that are able to negotiate with their respective leagues on how we're going to adjudicate these rules, and it reduces the amount of drug usage down to 10% or more, a little bit, and you compare that, contrast it to on the international scene, there is no representation, and you have athletes that are at 45%. Well, potentially, I mean, that tells me that we need to allow for athletes to have more say. It may very well drive down the amount of usage that we have, but then also it also makes it so that it's going to potentially be less dangerous, because if we have more of an open dialogue about what needs to be taken or what doesn't, that's where you get change.
Yeah. I think also there may be really interesting statistics, and I think that's a great solution. Is absolutely a great way to think about it. The other thing about unions is, I know in a lot of sports, there's higher proportions of guaranteed salaries, guaranteed contracts. Sure. And maybe those athletes aren't as worried about getting back on the field,
Absolutely.
Like maybe in the NFL or certain sports, they're like, yeah, I'm injured, but getting paid well. I'm not risking my life every day. It's not, I'm in no rush to take banned substances to try to get back on the field.
I would agree with that. And I think that, obviously each of the leagues collective bargaining agreements is different in terms of salary, which is a big thing. Salary is very important. But what's even more important is being vested in a retirement plan and being vested in lifelong health care after your playing days are over. Now, the MLB, I mean, you play one inning. I mean, one inning, you're vested. You got health care for the rest of your life. Wow. That's huge. That's huge.
That's amazing.
On the international scene, they've got nothing to back them up. They have a zero safety net. And think about the vast majority of athletes. The vast majority of athletes do not come from means. The vast majority of athletes in our country or internationally are coming from relatively poor backgrounds. They're relatively uneducated, and they have very few additional job skills beyond what they actually bring to the table right off the bat. So they know, if I wanted to lift myself and my family out of generational poverty, my best bet is to be an athlete on a high level, which is a huge incentive to taking drugs. Huge. Yeah. If we provide them with a guaranteed amount of money, if they perform well, obviously, but more importantly, at least some level of a couple of years of healthcare benefits after they get out. Because why do most of the athletes leave competition? Because they're broken down and destroyed.
Yeah.
And so obviously, if you want to remove the potential of cheating, and I put in quotation marks because it's cheating because we say it's cheating. If you change the rules tomorrow, it wouldn't be cheating anymore.
Yeah.
But if you remove the potential of them, being severely injured for the rest of their lives and having no one there to take care of them, the likelihood that they would want to take these drugs would be significantly reduced. That's my speculation, but I do have data to back it up.
Yeah. Interesting. I think was it the NFL numbers you quoted that were 10%?
Yes.
Yeah. I think my hypothesis is that people, even though it's an anonymous survey, lie more in the US and in the NFL because they're closer to a lot of the cultural events around doping and sports banning than maybe international athletes are. I think it's probably
which cultural events are you referring to? I'm just curious.
The ones you talked about, like the Carl Lewis, the Lance Armstrong, like each of those you named were US athletes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So they are closer to the idea of like scandals and like this negative stigma around PEDs and doping in sports than someone in France might be, or someone in
Maybe.
Italy.
There's a lot of doping scandals that happened in the aughts,
Yeah.
where there were these huge raids on different doctors' houses and offices, and they had
Okay.
lists and lists and lists of athletes who were, part of their flock. Tons of blood bags that were in storage that they found. I mean, so there's some really nasty scandals that take place in Europe as well. I think you're right, in as much as some people may have those things on their mind. However, what I do see is that, and this just tends to be the case with lots of things. The United States tends to be a little bit more puritanical in its approach to how we judge other people's actions, certainly not our own, but shame, and then absolutely annihilating and destroying people's lives because they've fallen short of our expectations. Whereas in Europe, they're not quite so vicious.
Yeah, that's a good point.
When someone they're much more willing to forgive and move on.
Yeah.
And so there's that. So you may be right. Anytime you have anonymous survey data, it's going to be better than if it's not anonymous, or if you're just taking your data from trying to catch people. But there's obviously still going to be people who
sure. The only reason I bring that up, I'm not sure. Are you familiar with an individual named Broderick Chavez?
No.
Okay, he helps a lot of professional athletes both take performance enhancing drugs and beat drug tests.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, he's biased, and he may not be entirely truthful when he says this, but he paints a picture that professional athletes in places like the NFL, it's almost ubiquitous that they're using something for performance enhancement.
Let me just be specific on the 10%. That was specifically steroids. So if we expanded beyond that, then I'm sure that number is going to increase dramatically. So I completely agree with your conjecture there. So yes, I think we're in agreement.
It seems like lots of the general public just think like, oh, one-off athletes use some type of performance enhancement, but the vast majority are completely clean. So is America's hero. They would never take a drug. And I think that's just a very optimistic view.
So let me just add on to that anecdote with the story of my father. He's a huge sports fan. He was born in Scotland. He moved over here when he was in his 20s. And so soccer is his big thing. He loves watching soccer. And so, his position is not the same as mine. He doesn't like doping in sport. And so he was just like, I just don't think I could get on board, or I can't even imagine what it would look like to watch soccer with a bunch of doped up athletes. And I was like, Dad, you're already watching soccer with a bunch of doped up athletes. You just don't know it.
Yeah.
Because there's no way to know who is or isn't. But I mean, as long as this thing is continued on, it's going to continue on forever. And all the chemists have to do is tweak a chemical a teensy little bit, and then it's undetectable. There's no incentive for athletes to do anything other than to continue the practices of the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And they'll just find new ways to get it out of their system quickly or cheat the test.
They don't even have to worry about getting it out of their system. If it's a chemical that's not detectable, they could take it in front of the testers that wouldn't even know it's there.
That's a great point. So I just wanted to share perspective too. I come from the sport of bodybuilding, which is completely untested, other than natural federations, which no one cares about. I care about. I think they're awesome, but most people completely ignore them. But like the Mr. Olympia, these athletes are obviously taking huge amounts of performance enhancing drugs, anabolics, and every year there's deaths in the sport, which happen. I can't say whether or not those deaths are statistically higher than the average population, but they obviously catch a lot of attention. And there's a discussion around like, should the governing organizations do some form of testing? Should they do education? Should they mandate blood work? And there's a lot of problems with that. Like, if you mandate blood work, what time of the year do you mandate it? Because some athletes will be competing and some won't, and some will be on drugs, some won't. If blood work has to reach certain values, how do you set those values? How do you trust the doctors these athletes are working with to be truthful? And so usually nothing happens. But I think one of the most dangerous things in bodybuilding is the use of diuretics. Like, I think most bodybuilders aren't dying from the use of anabolic steroids. It's diuretics, which really stress the kidneys, dehydrate them. And, a few bodybuilders have died very close to shows, competitions, because they're severely dehydrated, malnourished, really low body fat, very stressed, and they take diuretics to try to get even drier. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of share that anecdote and hear what you think about like an untested sport, and what you think like the organizations should do, or if you have any ideas around that.
I do. Obviously, we want to protect different people from their worst selves, right? And therein lies why we try to make rules for other people to follow that they may not want to follow themselves. And when it comes to a completely unregulated sport, as is bodybuilding, you are relying on that athlete to make a decision for themselves. And if you have a libertarian bent like I do, that's up to that person.
Yeah.
Up to and including if they die. And the reason I feel that way is because if we look at some of the more dangerous sports, death is a potential outcome in every single snap of a football game, every single turn of a NASCAR race.
Yep.
You can go on and on. Now, we try to make the games as safe as possible, but they're inherently dangerous.
Sure.
For bodybuilding, obviously there's no contact in that, but if you required athletes to then take testing or banned steroids from bodybuilding, you don't have bodybuilding anymore.
Yeah.
You have some other sport that is just not the same. And unless there is an appetite amongst the consumers of bodybuilding that they want to see a shift towards that, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Does it need to happen? I don't know that it does. I think you can obviously make an argument that you don't want athletes dying.
Yeah.
Obviously, I completely agree with you. But if the athlete is willing to take that risk to go out and do their job, that's up to them. And they are the ones who are going to be ultimately responsible for the outcome of what happens. So going back to your point about, cutting weight, this is not just in bodybuilding. This is in any weight or any sport that has weight divisions.
Yeah.
Olympic weightlifting, I was in the heaviest weight class there was. It didn't matter for me whatsoever. But if I looked at the people who were a couple weight classes below me, and so it's a little different there. Usually a weigh-in takes place within 24 to 48 hours prior to the competition.
Yeah.
In this case, with Olympic weightlifting, at least when the competitions that I went to, they weigh you in the day of. But let's go back of a boxing match or a UFC match, and you have an athlete who's trying to make their respective weight class. And we all know that you're walking around in weight is not where you're going to fight. You're going to fight many, many pounds lighter than that.
Yeah.
And so you do your best to cut weight prior to that weigh-in. And then as soon as it's done, then you recover and try to take in as much as you possibly can. And you can rebound 10, 15, maybe 20 pounds.
Yeah.
Okay. So that gives you some level of competitive advantage when you're in a ring with somebody who's a little bit smaller. But the same thing you're talking about, what are you going to be able to actually shed in terms of weight in 24 to 48 hours? Water.
Yeah.
Nothing else is coming off. You're not shedding fat.
Yeah.
No way.
Yeah.
And so you're going to sweat and you're going to poop and puke as much as you possibly can to get all this stuff out. Now, that is the worst possible thing you can do to your body prior to having an athletic event of any kind, but certainly least of all with someone who's trying to knock your block off.
Yeah.
So
or an endurance
that aspect
in the heat,
or an endurance, sure. But typically you're not going to see that as being, they're not going to have weight classes there unless, like with triathlon, they would put in the Clydesdales, which were athletes above 200 pounds.
Okay.
And the Athenas, and I think they were above 150, but it's not really a weight class.
Yeah.
It's just because, if I'm going to go do a triathlon, there's no way I'm going to keep up with a wafy, thin little dude who weighs 150 pounds. I'm 270. But so even if they put me in the Clydesdale, I can't keep up with it.
Yeah.
For real weight. And I've heard from a number of people anecdotally that there's only so many times you can cut weight in your life because it's such a vicious event on your body
Mm,
that you just can't do it after a certain period of
yeah.
time.
Yeah, I actually come from competitive lightweight rowing,
Mhm.
which is an example of an endurance event with extreme weight cutting. And it's actually a lot safer at the like championship international level than it is at the collegiate level. At the collegiate level, it's 24 hours. It's like the day before, right? And there's no rules around it whatsoever. Like at
They
least
never
in
are.
rest, at least in wrestling, there's like some notion of like a doctor's note or something, but there's also no guidance. The coaches
Yeah.
were like, make weight. I don't care how you do it. Don't tell me how you do it. And we would literally, guys would not eat for 4 days, not drink for 2 days, and go in a trash bag and
Mhm.
sweat in a sauna for
So
hours.
you have a weight class in rowing.
Yeah.
So if you don't make weight, then you don't actually go to that competition.
Yep.
I never knew that. I just assumed you
Yeah.
would be doing that just for the sake of being a little bit
Yeah.
lighter in the water.
Yeah. The way it works is the entire boat has to weigh on average 155 pounds, and
Interesting.
no individual can weigh more than 160 pounds.
Okay. So then here's my suggestion when it comes to these things. We're kind of getting away from our
Yeah.
topic, but you can legislate these things out in terms of rules for that particular sport.
Yeah.
I mean, you could have it just be 100% open weight class and let people go at it.
That's what it should be.
And that's what it should be, right?
Yeah.
But that's something. And so if you're going to have a rule in place as an athletic organization, and you know that that rule is requiring your athletes to then do these really remarkably dangerous things, then you have to either change the rule, or you have to provide education and medical assistance during the weight cut. You can't have athletes just saying, "Hey, coach, what do I do? Go do what my grandpappy did. Hop in the sauna with
Yeah.
a garbage bag on your head for the next 4
Or
hours and
ask
take
the
a bunk
seniors
sack,
on the
X
team.
legs." Yeah, I
Ask
mean,
the
that's just
seniors on the team.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
So, we're completely abdicating any type of adult responsibility to a bunch of kids.
Yeah.
That's so then, obviously there's ways to fix that without vilifying performance enhancing drugs.
Yeah. Yeah. No, what's even worse is there's competitive lightweight rowing at the high school level for women.
Mm.
Talk about eating disorders. It's scary. I think lightweight rowing just shouldn't exist. Like if you're not tall enough, not big enough to be a regular rower, like just find another sport or go in a lower boat. Like,
Mhm.
there's a reason
Or
there's like
quad.
a first varsity, a second varsity, a third
Right.
varsity, a fourth varsity. Like, I think it's just silly. But anyway, I digress. Um, I wanted to ask about what the climb score is. This is something you talked about in your book that I thought was really interesting.
Okay, so this is something that I came up with myself in terms of this is about cycling. So let me just briefly discuss the cycling season. It starts in the spring with what are called the spring classics. These are just 1 day races, but they're really quite impressive to watch. They'll go across miles and miles of cobblestones on
Perry
these
Roubaix,
remarkably narrow road. Paris Roubaix is a big
love
one.
it.
And then you get into the Grand Tour season, which is throughout the summer. And so you have the Giro that just ended, so it's through May. So that's the Tour of Italy. Then you have the Tour de France, which is the biggest of all races. That's in July. And then in August, late August to September, you have the Vuelta a España. So that's the Tour of Spain. And so the Tour is number one, Giro is number two, the Vuelta is number three, and then you have your World Championships after that, and then it kind of just peters off. The tours are 3 week long races, and they cover around 2,000 to 2,300 miles over 23 days. There's at least one, and sometimes in this more recently, two recovery days. And for like when you look at the Tour de France, it circumnavigates the entirety of the country of France, which is roughly the size of Texas. There's an initial week and an end week where the stages are relatively flat. And so you have all these different races within races. So the flat stages are going to be for the sprinters, and they have their own award for winning their own jersey, which is the green jersey.
Yeah.
But the race itself really plays out in the mountains. And so you will always go through the Alps, you'll always go through the Pyrenees, and then from time to time, there's a central mountain range called the Central Massif that they go through as well. And it's those mountain ranges where the torture really happens. And it's marketed that way. If you see the highlights of the previous stage or the previous week, they're always going to show some miserable bastard who's trying to drag his ass up, an alpine slope that's at this remarkably steep grade. He's got drool dropping out of his mouth. He's just dying.
Yeah.
And so what I was looking at was to look at, when did the three big drugs come into the Tour de France? So the first one would have been amphetamines, which was after World War II. Then the next one would have been cortisol and steroid hormones like that'll assist with recovery very quickly. If you've ever had a sinus infection and your doctor gave you a cortisone injection or cortisone taper pack, then, within 3 or 4 hours, you feel great because that cortisol is coursing through your body, and it may keep you up at night because it kind of revs you up.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing that it does for you in terms, prednisone. The same thing it does for you when you're a cyclist. And then there's erythropoietin, so EPO. So EPO is a different hormone that we produce naturally when we have too little oxygen in our blood. And the response to that is that EPO is released by the kidneys, goes to the bone marrow, and it generates additional red blood cells to carry more oxygen. If you take this exogenously, then you get this huge boost of red blood cells, and it can really dramatically improve performance. So the point was, let's look throughout the history of the Tour de France and generate some objective score that we can say which tour was tougher than another, just based strictly on the climbing that they had to do. Okay, so you can have a climb be really tough if it's super long and it can be at a relatively low grade, or it can be super tough if it's remarkably steep and it can still be short. So you multiply the percent grade by the total distance from where the climb started to where it finishes in terms of the horizontal distance, and you get this score. And then you add up all the scores for the different mountains that are in there, and then you get a total climb score for the whole race. So what I was looking at was, where do we see spikes in the climb score and what happened right around there? And it was, I didn't know that this was going to happen. It just had turned out that way.
It was really cool.
And I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was in the 50-ish the time there that we saw a spike, and then 2 years later, we had the first admitted use of amphetamines in the Tour.
Wow.
Then in the 70s, I think it was 72, we had a spike. And then in 73, we had the first confirmed case of cortisol usage at a wide scale in the Tour. And then in 87, we had our biggest climb score ever, and it hasn't been surpassed since. And 3 years-ish later, we saw that EPO had finally made its way into the Tour. So what I was proposing was that every time the Tour organizers decide that they really want to grind it to the athletes and make them suffer a little bit more, the athletes are, well, look, if you can make me hurt this bad, I'm going to do whatever I can to stop the suffering. So they find a new drug to take. And then it pervades throughout the peloton, which means the group of cyclists who are competing rapidly, because they share stories, they share anecdotes. Even though they're on a different team, that's my buddy. I used to ride with him, race for my same country. I'm going to tell him about this new thing. And so it was very clear to me that every time that they increased the intensity of the tour to get more TV ratings, which is really where the money comes from, the athletes responded by saying, look, I got to have something else because you're killing me. Yeah. And so after they had the whole thing with Lance Armstrong, so this was in the early 2000s, they really brought down the climb score quite a bit. And then it starts creeping back up again. Yeah. So we see, like, 2 years ago, the climb score was actually 4 years ago. The climb score went back up. It was huge. And then this last year, there are a lot of suspicious things happening in terms of the results of the Tour de France that I think tells me that there's something new that's in the peloton that they haven't found yet. So that was really the point of why I came up with that score to begin with.
Yeah, really, really cool. I loved it. Really interesting statistical analysis. And another thing you talk about in the book is bans on inaccurately claimed competitive advantages of drugs, such as cannabis. Can you talk a little bit about this and what your thoughts are there?
Yes, I can. So, like I spoke about this at the beginning, my evolution of thought about doping over time. And I was in a conversation with my wife while we were watching the Tour de France one day, several years ago. And I said, I can see why athletes would want to take these drugs, because look at how much they have to do just to stay on the damn team, in the Tour. And then, a few days later, we were watching the Olympic trials. Now, they were postponed in 2021 because of COVID. And so this is Sha'Carri Richardson, who is a native Dallasite, like I am. I'm not native, she is, but I live in Dallas. She won the 100-meter dash at the Olympic trials by a huge margin, and there's no way you can miss Sha'Carri Richardson because she's bombastic. I love this girl. She's amazing. 2 days later, she gets tested positive for THC and is disqualified from that competition and subsequently is disqualified from the Olympics altogether. So at no point did she deny taking THC. Her reason for doing so is it's pretty interesting and it's quite nuanced. So first of all, the Olympic trials are in Oregon, a state where marijuana is legal.
Yep.
She did not have a very good history with her birth mother. I don't know that she had much of a relationship at all. She was raised by her grandmother. And a reporter ambushed her after learning that her mother had died. Sha'Carri Richardson did not know this and basically gave her, a classic gotcha question of, how do you respond to knowing that your birth mother recently died? A really nasty thing to do to somebody. She had a bit of an anxiety attack. I'm not diagnosing that. I'm just assuming that that's what it was. And her response to that was to get some weed and smoke it or eat it. I'm not sure what she did, but there was never any intent on her part to enhance her performance. She knew that it was against the rules. She knew that she was going to get tested. That tells you how desperate you are as a person to alleviate your stress. If you know it's against the rules and you know you're going to get tested, you know you're likely going to pop. She did it anyway.
Yeah. Wow.
She's not exactly in her right mind when she makes that decision, as I think most human beings would probably be if they had been ambushed with that kind of a question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Under those circumstances, no less. The biggest races of your entire life, and you have to deal with this son of a bitch doing this to you. Excuse my French. Yeah. So when that came down, I was irate. I was beside myself. Yeah. Mostly because I had no idea that THC was on the banned list. And so my immediate thought is, well, wait a minute, this can't possibly be considered a performance enhancing drug.
Yeah.
I've taken marijuana on many occasions. I usually do once a night so I can sleep. I can tell you that the anecdote that I told in my book was when my wife and I were in Portland. We had gone to my sister's wedding in Washington and then traveled down to Portland to continue our little vacation. We went to a dispensary because we don't have access to that stuff in Texas.
Yeah.
And after we put our daughter to bed, we had a couple pieces of chocolate. And I can tell you the profound, what word do I want to use? Incapacitation I felt having been that high. I couldn't move, let alone try to compete at anything. So the notion that this is a performance enhancing drug is an utter joke.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be on the ban list at all. Now, their reasoning for doing so is that they call marijuana and other illicit drugs of abuse. And so since they're illegal throughout the world, by and large, they should also be illegal to athletes. This is their logic. My logic, it's none of your damn business if I'm taking something that's illegal or not. Just mind your business. Stick to the stuff that's going to impact the sport. And if it's not going to impact the sport, then leave me alone. Yeah. So then they subsequently came up with this paper where they made the claim that it does have performance-enhancing benefits in as much as there's lots of anecdotal evidence, particularly from players in the NBA, that when they smoke weed, they play better because they're able to focus. Maybe, but I seriously doubt it. And it has not been tested or confirmed.
Yeah.
So that's a huge problem that I have, knowing that we sacrificed one of our best athletes at the 2020 Olympics, completely threw her under the bus.
Yeah.
And for no particular justifiable reason whatsoever.
Yeah. I hate hearing stories like that, where athletes are just terribly mistreated.
Completely. What would USADA or WADA suggest for her to do instead of taking marijuana? They would likely ask her to take a benzodiazepine, which is going to be Valium or Xanax.
Yeah.
Now, those drugs definitely don't have a performance-enhancing benefit, but I can tell you, I took Xanax for a while for sleep as well, and it had serious side effects on my body that I didn't even realize were there until I couldn't get a doctor prescribe me that anymore. Wow. And I had to go off cold turkey. That was a rough coming off for 3 or 4 days, not being able to sleep. Yeah. But as soon as that part was done, all of those side effects that I was experiencing, gastrointestinal, finger tingling, all went away.
Yeah.
All went away. So which would you rather have your athletes consume? Would you rather that they take a drug that grows from a plant that grows naturally on every continent in the world except for Antarctica? Or would you rather them take a pharmaceutical that we know has massive side effects and is addictive? I'm gonna go for the natural thing every time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No, in my previous career, I worked for a cannabis company, so I'm with you all the way. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Hutchinson. It's been great. I've learned a ton talking to you. You're clearly very passionate about sports and athletes and the subject, and very, very knowledgeable. Tell people a little bit about the book, and I'll, of course, have a link to it in the show notes as well.
Sure. So the book is called In Defense of Doping. I published it myself. We were in negotiation with a couple different publishers, but they were anxious about the controversy of the topic, so we went on our own. You can find it on Amazon, in addition to my other two books that are also there. And you can find me at goodegg.fitness. So good egg is one word, GOOD, and then EGG.fitness.
Okay, great. I'll have links to that. Thank you again for your time, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the show. You can find The Scott Mize Show on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Please leave a comment, like, review, or share the podcast with your friends or followers. It helps more people find the show.